Good afternoon, and welcome to this lecture by Professor Matthew Happold on international law in a multipolar world, perspectives in the age of Trump, Putin, and Brexit. The title sounds quite exciting, I must say, and it was agreed between the two of us, together with our colleagues, Professor Politi, Professor Ali, and Dr. Fasoli, who are here with Professor Happold. Professor Happold is the chair of the University of Luxembourg, of the School of Law of the University of Luxembourg, the chair of international law. He studied in the UK, and I think that he left some years ago the UK in order to teach in the University of Luxembourg. And I'm sure that he will maybe say something about what leaving the UK means instead of UK leaving the EU means. But I think that what we can do, and he's the author, I'm sorry, is the author of this book entitled International Law in a Multipolar World. Actually, he's the editor of this book. There are several contributions, very interesting contributions by many authoritative authors. And Professor Happold coordinated these efforts that started, as far as I understood, in 2009, but he will tell us something more on this issue. I don't want to lose his and your time, so I'll give him the floor, asking him to make his presentation, and then after the presentation, if there is everybody's agreement, so we can have a Q&A session. And he already gave his availability to answer your questions. So, Professor Happold, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dean, and can I have the opportunity to express my thanks for the invitation to come here. It's great to be here. And it may be an exciting title. I hope my talk will live up to the title. And I did edit some years ago a book called International Law in a Multipolar World, available at no good bookshops for a large price. It was a conference, the book arose out of a conference that held in 2009. So we're talking about 8 years ago. That we started thinking on this issue. And interestingly enough, the book came out in 2012. And then the next year, the American Society of International Law had their annual meeting on the subject of international law in the multipolar world, which I think shows that what Europe thinks, one day, America thinks a few days afterwards. Maybe they're only beginning to see the implications of what are, I think, quite profound changes in international relations, in the global economy, in international politics, and consequently, as a result, in international law. But what those changes might mean, I think, is quite difficult to know in the long run. And when we put together the book, one of the things that was interesting was we found it very difficult to come up with any consistent theme. On the one hand, there were some people who were, if you like, I suppose, quite optimistic, and they talked about things such as, increased perceptions of global justice, about the growing importance of democracy as a norm within the international system. But then you also had people who were talking about rather perhaps more old-fashioned things, about how multipolarity might be more about regionalism, might see a breakup of global conceptions of international law towards competing subsystems where regional organizations took a more important role, or where great powers served as the hegemons within their regions. And that, of course, is something that I think we see in Europe. I talked this morning a bit about EU economic sanctions from the international law perspective. And one of the interesting areas there, and it was something that was picked up in the book by a couple of contributors, one of the interesting areas there is that on the one hand, the EU does claim to be acting on the international level to vindicate community values, but on the other hand, by doing so, it's also projecting itself as being a community expressing particular values which are not necessarily shared by all actors in the international system. And it does so, it seeks to promote those values often in a way that is unilateral rather than multilateral, and doesn't go through the multilateral system. In particular, it doesn't go through the United Nations. But then again, the critiques that are made of that, particularly by Russia and China, would probably be more convincing if one of the reasons the EU is acting unilaterally in situations, imposing economic sanctions in situations such as Syria, and indeed with regards to Russia, in response to its actions in occupying and purportedly annexing the Crimea, is that, of course, Russia and China are blocking meaningful action by the United Nations Security Council. So we're in a situation, I think, of flux, and it's difficult to know perhaps where we're going and what the implications are with the changes in international politics and the global economy, what those implications will be for the development of international law. But I think what's interesting is in the first place how much has changed really in the 5 years. It's only 5 years since the book came out. Then, of course, we had in the United States of America, we still had the Obama administration, some tendency towards unilateralism. I think all U.S. administrations tend to act unilaterally when they must, if they can't act multilaterally. But by and large, an administration that did see the value of international law and international institutions. And of course, at the end of the Obama administration, we saw the brokering of the deal with regards to the Iranian nuclear issue, with the agreement between Iran, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and the EU. Very, very important, I think, really a triumph of multilateral diplomacy, dealing with a situation that had really been festering for quite a number of years. And, well, we don't know what's going to happen with regards to that now, with Mr. Trump now as US President. That was quite important. That seemed to say that there was still scope for negotiated settlements. And also, of course, we had the US involvement, in particular at the later stages, and which saw the eventual adoption of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Again, probably, let's face it, the most important international agreement we've had in recent years. I might, live out my life without having to worry too much about climate change. You lot probably won't. Your children will certainly be worried, and particularly, of course, if Mr. Trump decides that the US is not going to participate and not going to work towards the targets and the commitments embodied in that agreement. So in the US, we had an administration that, was criticized for not engaging on the international level, for being quite not sufficiently activist, but nonetheless was willing to seek multilateral solutions. Back in 2012, though, we did begin to see problems elsewhere. So, of course, with regards to Russia, which is, if we like, the problem child in the international legal system in recent years, we'd already seen Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, which was, let's face it, a fairly major event. It's quite uncommon in the post-Cold War period for states to invade other states, although obviously it does happen, and the US has not, and the UK and other states have not been guiltless on this themselves. But an important event, because it did very much announce that the Russian Federation did take the view that it had spheres of influence, countries around its border, countries that had been members of the former Soviet Union, that it considered it had a right to intervene in when what it considers its national interests were at stake. And of course, since then, in 2013, that's very much been, the pessimistic analyses of that have very much been confirmed with following, well, at the same time as the regime change going on in Ukraine, we see Russian intervention in support of the separatists in eastern Ukraine, and most importantly, we see Russian intervention in the Crimea, expelling Ukrainian forces, expelling the Ukrainian administration, and purporting at the beginning of March 2013 to annex that territory so that it becomes a part of the territory of the Russian Federation. Now, again, annexation of territory, that's a step beyond really changing. Intervention, temporary interventions, maybe involving regime change is one thing, but you might think annexation of territory of another state, violation of the rules on territorial integrity, state sovereignty, that's really another thing. That was a very major event indeed. We saw, of course, that the General Assembly did react. It said that it was that the annexation should not be recognized. Not by an enormous majority. It was 100 states voted for that resolution, but nonetheless, a majority of members of the United Nations. And we saw reactions in the form of economic sanctions by a number of states, the United States of America, Australia, Canada, Norway, and of course the European Union. But that has been unsuccessful in reversing the situation. I think that situation is likely to persist for some time. And of course, since then, Russia has become more assertive, more militarily aggressive in terms of testing NATO borders, particularly with its air force, more aggressive in terms of cyber attacks. Estonia had a particular experience of that, and we saw, the intervention, according to the FBI anyway, in the US presidential elections. But also, and I think this is really quite important, what we've seen is that Russia has become much more assertive at the legal level. It's been doing it for a number of years, setting out in terms of its national security strategies, its foreign policy strategies, what it considers international law to require, what it considers international law to permit. And that really, I think, we saw a very important development in June last year when we get a joint declaration made both by the Russian Federation and by the People's Republic of China. They call it on the promotion of international law, but it very much sets out how those two states view international law and the international legal system. And it's very much about responding to Western views on international law and seeking to provide a different analysis, or even, if you like, a different vision of international law. And I have a copy here, and I actually really do recommend people to read it, because it's only 2 pages, which is always nice. But it's a very interesting document. It starts off by saying, Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, are committed to the principles of international law as reflected in the United Nations Charter and the 1970 Friendly Relations Declaration, General Assembly Resolution. Is it 2625? I can never remember which way around. It is 2625 of 1970. And now you might say, well, what's wrong with that? That seems, don't we all believe in the United Nations Charter and the Friendly Relations Declaration, which we always say as teachers of international law is an authoritative interpretation. It was adopted, if I remember, without a vote by the General Assembly. Authoritative interpretation of what the Charter says. But of course, the Charter can be interpreted in quite a number of ways. And I think it's important that one of the things that it likes is it likes the principles in the Charter, but rather less the purposes. So it's in favour of things like sovereignty and non-intervention, and it's less in favour of things like self-determination and the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Interestingly enough, and it's obvious that if you read the Declaration, I think it's fairly obvious that it's a negotiated text. It says that Russia and China are also guided by the principles enshrined in the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Now, you may not be aware of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. This is sort of old school international law. They were expressed in a treaty, the Panshield Treaty, which was adopted in 1954 between India and China. I think it was really the first significant treaty that the People's Republic of China, after it was established in 1949, entered into with one of its neighbours. And again, they are extremely sovereignty-based. They are about mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and cooperation for mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. So there is very much these ideas that international law is about states, and it's about sovereignty, and it's about non-interference. Now, you might say, that sounds a bit hypocritical, given the Russian Federation's interference, to say the least, if not use of force, against its neighbours in recent years. But there you are. And if you continue reading the Declaration, one of the things it's very big on is the principle of sovereign equality. The principle of sovereign equality is crucial for the stability of international relations. But I think you have to be careful when you read that. What you have to remember, of course, is China and Russia are very supportive of the Charter of the United Nations, and one thing they're very supportive about in the Charter is that they like about the Charter is they are permanent members of the Security Council, and as such they have a veto. But very much a view that it's perhaps we might say it's not about sovereign equality for all states. I think it's fairly obvious that Russia and China don't think that they have to treat, say, Ukraine or Vietnam in the same way as they have to treat other permanent members of the Security Council. But there is this idea that they, as members of the Security Council, are worth as much as any other members, and they must be respected, and their interests must be taken into account. And I think when you read it, that is really the subtext, that although it talks about sovereignty, although it talks about intervention, it's very much saying, we are permanent members of the Security Council, we are great powers, and that is something that international law should respect. And the international system must reflect. And one of the things I find really interesting about the Declaration, in fact, is the 6th paragraph, which says that the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China share the view that good faith implementation of generally recognized principles and rules of international law excludes the practice of double standards or imposition by some states of their will on other states. And I think this is the idea that they feel that Europe and the United States of America have weaponized international law that they use it as a way of saying you must act in a particular way. This is what international law says. International law says you must respect human rights. International law says you must be nice. You must be nice to your neighbours. International law says this. International law says that, and those are double standards, and they're standards that the US and the EU do not live up to themselves. And when we look at the history in the past few years of how the US in particular has acted on the international stage, if you look at events such as the detention of unlawful combatants at Guantanamo Bay, if you look at events such as the 2003 invasion of Iraq, you can see why, from a Russian or a Chinese perspective, the views expressed by Western leaders and by Western scholars as well about the emancipatory potential of international law might appear a bit hollow. I don't justify the actions of either the Russian or the Chinese governments, but you can. I think that they're using international law instrumentally, but I think that's a reproach that can also be laid against Western leaders, and I think it's obvious to see why these critiques resonate with their populations, which is, one of the audiences of these statements. The rest of the declaration is quite interesting, but they're largely very discrete issues. So, China was unhappy with being brought. With Philippines bringing in arbitration against it under the provisions of Part 15 of the 1982 UN Law of the Sea Convention. So there's a bit about the importance of disputes being settled by mutual agreement and negotiation and jumping through all the procedural hoops and so on. That's China's thing. There's another bit about how autonomous sanctions or unilateral coercive measures are a bad thing, which is something that Russia is concerned about, because it's been sanctioned as a result of its activities in Crimea. There's a bit about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, interestingly enough, which is, I think, largely because both of those states find it annoying that the US will not become a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, while cherry-picking bits out of it and saying, well, that's customary, we like that bit. That's customary international law, and therefore it binds all states and gives us rights. But those bits of the convention we don't like, and we're not a party to the convention, so we don't have to comply with it. So I really recommend reading this. It's a concise, albeit I think often quite implicit view, précis of what Russia and China's views on international law are, and I think we'll be seeing a lot more of this. And I think what we do have to recognize is that although decolonization may seem a long time ago, a lot of states in the world do take ideas of sovereign equality, the principle of non-intervention as really quite important in international law. So are we going to move? Is this going to be a retrograde step in international law? I suppose it depends how you look at it, but certainly those sovereignty-based defences against what those states would see as interference in their internal affairs, I think, are going to persist and take strength from the views being expressed. The other interesting thing, I think, is what I said, is that what's implicit in this is an idea that there's sovereign equality, but perhaps it's sovereign equality of the permanent members of the Security Council. And we've already seen, it's very clear that Russia considers, the Russian Federation considers that it has a right to act within, it has a sphere of influence where it has special privileges and it's entitled to intervene. Quite how that relates to, its express statements is difficult to say, but nonetheless, that's what it's saying. The problem there, of course, in terms of international politics, is that it seems that that sphere of influence overlaps with the territory, in particular, of the European Union, or possibly, if it includes the Baltic states. And we have seen Russian interference in the Baltic states. In Ukraine as well, we've seen it, and Ukraine is an area where the Russians claim to be reacting to EU and US, well, I won't use the term aggression, that would be wrong, but those states involving themselves in Ukraine's internal affairs in a way that is to Russia's disadvantage. China, of course, we've seen that. The South China Sea arbitration came about as a result of what is known as, it's the nine-line dash, isn't it? Which is basically China has decided to draw a boundary in the South China Sea, which basically gives all the South China Sea to China. That's a unilateral act. It claims that it's willing to negotiate with the various littoral states there, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia. But we're yet to see that it's doing so, and certainly it's trying to, let's say, put facts on the ground, build up a number of reefs and shoals, turn them into installations that possibly can be used for military purposes. And there have already been very minor clashes within the area. So are we moving into a period of spheres of influence again? And what effect might that have on international law? And one of the things that we looked at when we were putting together the collection was what is meant if we talk about a multipolar world, and is this something that is conducive to greater tensions or greater instability, or is it something that actually might paradoxically lead to greater stability? And one of the interesting things is, if you look at the literature going back to the beginning of the 19th century, there is a considerable literature that says that actually thought that multipolar systems, and this was originally within Europe, were a good thing. And in those days, there was very much an idea of the balance of power, the idea that if you have a number of sites of power within a particular international system, then they check each other. If one looks like it's getting too powerful, then the other ones will combine to ensure that doesn't happen. And in particular, I looked at a book by Friedrich von Gens, who published his book Fragments upon the Balance of Power in Europe in 1806. Interestingly enough, what he did was he wrote the book in 1805, and then it was published in 1806. And what happened in the meantime between him finishing it and the book being published was Napoleon's victory over Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz. So their complete French hegemony over Europe, complete final destruction of the Ancien regime. And he looked back, I think with considerable nostalgia, said, things were great in the good old days. In the good old days, we had a balance of power in Europe. He said, it's a constitution, he said, subsisting among neighbouring states more or less connected with one another, by virtue of which no one among them can injure the independence or the essential rights of another without meeting with effectual resistance on some side, and consequently exposing itself to danger. So he very much contrasted, hegemony, here, embodied in Napoleonic France, with the pre-revolutionary balance of power. Now, of course, if you actually look at the history of Europe in the 18th century, you find that it is punctuated by a series of wars. Sometimes they're called cabinet wars. The idea is, you didn't have mass mobilization of the population as we did in the Napoleonic and revolutionary period. But anyone who's read Voltaire's Candide will know that didn't stop, considerable suffering on the civilian population. If you remember what happens to Candide's family in that. So, do we want a system? The question is, do we want a system where equilibrium has to be reimposed through conflict? And also, but we might say, is the choice between hegemony, which we essentially have had since the end of the Cold War in terms of US influence. I always tell my students that I think the US military budget remains more than the next 17 military budgets in the world combined. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, it's enormous. We still have, we might say we still have US hegemony, but there's definitely challenges to that. Is that something that we would prefer, moving towards a multipolar world, moving towards hegemony? And I think the other thing, moving towards a system based on the balance of power. And I think the other thing that we have to remember about that is that, Gens is looking back. What's he looking back at? What he's looking back at nostalgia with is Ancien Regime Europe, which was great if you were an aristocrat in Versailles. Yeah, it was brilliant. You might get smallpox, obviously, but by and large, it was great. But it was less great if you were a peasant on one of these nobles' estates. And there's a reason why that system ended and why it was unsustainable. And the balance of power is very much based, on views of state sovereignty, on views of subsystems which have their own internal logics. Yeah. And do we want to do that? And what will that say for projects that we might wish to advance that privilege things such as human rights and democracy? And you only need to look, for example, at the other instances of sort of Russian renewed national self-confidence, or whatever you want to call it at the moment. So intolerance of homosexuality, legalization of beating your wife. I'm not sure these are things many of us would be particularly in favor of, although one never knows. I wouldn't presume to speak for everyone in the room. So that leaves one issue, of course, which is, what about the United States of America? Mr. Trump has been president for just over 100 days now. I think it was Chow En-lao, Chinese foreign minister, who, when asked, I think in the 1970s, what do you think about the French Revolution, said, well, it's too early to say. So with Trump, maybe it's too early to say. And actually, I think it's very difficult to know what he thinks. Like we were talking earlier, and I said the problem with Trump, I find, is it depends what he's had for breakfast or whether he's slept well. He seems very erratic. But what we are definitely seeing is ignoring all the chatter we've heard about alleged contacts between people within the administration or the pre-administration or close to Trump and Russian interests. Ignoring all of that, we are seeing paradoxically both a return to isolationism, the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, for example, but also and I think this must be the crassest thing I've heard in international politics. Well, I thought it was, actually, until I looked at the UK papers this week. The presenting of a bill to Frau Merkel for all the money that the United States had allegedly spent defending it within the umbrella of NATO. Again, the idea that this is not an alliance where all are committed, but it's something that the US, can withdraw from, is not a part of unless it's getting something out of it. So we're seeing, on the one hand, very clear tendencies towards isolationism, but also tendencies towards unilateralism as well. And you mentioned earlier, I don't know if anyone looked at the statements made by Mr. Trump concerning North Korea, essentially saying, we will solve this problem, we will solve it unilaterally, and we don't exclude launching preemptive attacks. Now that is quite frightening, I find, particularly in a system that is, I think, tending at the moment towards multipolarity. It's not the sort of thing that any one state, even the United States of America, will be able to do without serious consequences, even ignoring the fact that North Korea could flatten Seoul, the capital of South Korea, which is, what, 25 kilometers from the line of control or something. You know, it's within range of its heavy artillery if the US launches an attack on it. So, very frightening statements. We have to see. Hopefully, you know, we won't have Mr. Trump for more than 4 years.
Come on.
Yeah, but I don't know. I've given up trying to predict anything in politics in the last few years. Which leads talking about craziness. Yes, I will say something about. So from the sublime to the ridiculous. I did say I've talked about Putin. I've talked about Trump. Let's say something about Brexit. What shall I say about? I'm not going to talk about UK internal politics because I might swear. But I will say something about its potential effects, and I think its potential effects. I think we're in a very funny situation at the moment. You know, the United Kingdom government's taking an extremely hard line, very much influenced by hard Brexiteers, and that is leading to a pushback, I think, by the member states of the European Union, and some of them, I think, frankly, are being rather opportunistic at the moment. That's not helpful for anyone. I may be biased on this one. I think that it will be a very bad thing for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, but I think it will be a very bad thing for the European Union as well. And my reason for that is simply that the European Union may, as a subsystem, actually be a good example of the benefits of multipolarity and the balance of power. Because we have seen, you know, there are a number of large states in the European Union and a number of smaller states, and by and large, because of the distribution of power between those constituent parts, everyone's by and large had to get along, and they've seen it as a continuing game, which means that you have to compromise now on things that aren't important for you in order to get your way later when things that are important. I think the failure of successive British governments to get that dynamic has been of historic proportions. Actually, I don't think British representatives in Brussels have failed to understand that, but they have failed to convince British politicians and the British electorate more generally that is the nature of the system. But of course, what we have seen in recent years, and really pretty much during my time in Luxembourg, is that France in particular has been very absent from the European stage, whereas Germany has been very present. And the United Kingdom leaving the European Union will mean that Germany is increasingly dominant. Now, I don't think that's a good thing, and I don't say that because I think it's a bad thing that Germany is dominant within the European Union, and if you don't believe me, you should look at my surname. I say it because I think that it is a bad idea that any power dominates within the European Union, and we've already seen the issues that arose with regard to Greece and its financial situation, and the real visceral passions that emerge when states consider they are being dictated to by other more powerful states. So is the European Union an example of a multipolar subsystem? Can that be reproduced on the international stage? I would love to think so, but I think we have to acknowledge that the European Union is the product of an extremely distinctive history, which may be difficult to reproduce elsewhere. And in fact, that is what makes it so tragic that that circumstances today have led to that project, to the threats that we see to that. What I think is an admirable project that we see today. So I hope I've spoken for long enough. I'm not sure I've given any answers. That's very much, I think, a sort of tour of the, round the world in 40 minutes, 45 minutes. Really meant to inspire reflection rather than to give conclusions. So anyway, I will end there, and I look very much forward to hearing to what other people on the panel and in the audience think of the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Yeah, you gave a broad picture of what is happening in the world, and of course now our fears are rising, and maybe we have to look for a bunker somewhere in our little neighborhood. However,
it's called Luxembourg.
No, I thank you very much for these reflections that are very stimulating, and of course we always think about what is happening in the world, and I refer to Putin, Trump and Brexit, lato sensu, without thinking of the connections with international law. While, I mean, we do it, but usually this is not what happens. And for this reason, I think that your presentation was very interesting. However, I would ask the students, first of all, maybe to whether they have any question, and if they don't have any questions, they will. And at the same time, of course, I ask the panel whether we are ready to make any question. Maybe Elena is ready. Yeah, so right. Please, Dr. Fasoli, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Matthew, again for this very interesting presentation. When I was reading the introduction to the book, I was looking at this bit where you were describing the attitude actually of Western scholars, some of them, that they saw a threat rather than an opportunity for this going towards a multipolar perspective or approach, and when you said seeing it as a fragmentation of international law in an increasingly divided world. And when I read the divided world expression, they really immediately remind me about this book that you told me before that you didn't read.
I haven't read.
Yes, it's.
I shall read it.
It's Jürgen Habermas, one of the prominent, most important thinkers, German thinkers actually. And years ago, when I was reading the book, which was written right after the 9/11 attacks and right after the intervention in 2003 in Iraq in the war, I was reading the foreword actually of the book, and it struck me actually because, and I'm gonna read it for you, just a few lines if you want, just to start the conversation that we have together, and it begins like this: the West was not divided by the danger of international terrorism, but by policies of the current US government that ignore international law, marginalize the United Nations, and accept the inevitability of the break with Europe. So these words were written in a kind of era where there was a hegemonic approach, still hegemonic attitude. And if we read them nowadays, going towards the multipolar actually world and approach, well, nothing has changed. Something has changed, of course, and many many other Western states have started to do what the US administration was doing already back into 2004, because it was 2004. And much more, well, many more, even more Western states have been ignoring international law, have been trying to cancel international commitments, United Kingdom and the attempt to delete the Human Rights Act, for example, in order to avoid the direct applicability of the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, we know the example. The revival of nationalism spread around Europe. So just to say that, I don't know about this increasingly divided world, but as far as I'm reading this book, back in 2004, I'm just saying, well, certainly I would agree on an increasingly divided West.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I will take you the criticism in the UK of the Human Rights Act, and I will raise you the opposition to CETA in Wallonia. And I know they sound quite different, and I actually am quite in favour of the European Convention of Human Rights and rather less in favour of CETA. But I think that there is a genuine concern among, and I see this completely ignored in a lot of conferences I go to, because I go to a lot of conferences on international investment arbitration. There is, I think, increasing concern from people that they feel that they have no influence on their lives, and that decisions are being made by global elites a long way away, and by technocrats whose decisions they can't control. And some of that we might sympathise with when we agree with what they're concerned about, which might be something like CETA or TTIP. And then some things we might disagree with when we like the relevant international instruments like the European Convention on Human Rights. But I think in many respects there is, we are more globalized, and people are more conscious of that, and that is leading to various reactions. And we see that across Europe. It takes place in various ways according to the local conditions, and Italy has its own populist movements, as does other countries in Europe, and they all take quite different forms. But I think that in many respects they're based on a weird mixture of sort of powerlessness and indeed on nostalgia. The weird thing about Brexit in the UK was that 2/3 of people over 65 voted to leave the United Kingdom, and 2/3 of people under 25 voted to leave the United Kingdom. Sorry, Freud. That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen.
Exactly.
The European Union, and 2/3 of people under 25 voted to remain in the European Union. And as my brother rather unkindly said, of course, old people think that the 1950s were much better than now. Because then they could bend their knees and probably have sex more regularly. Although I wouldn't like to comment on that. But there is an idea. We all think there's a golden age there that we enjoyed ourselves, and it may be that we were just younger and sprier. I like to think I'm young and spry now, but I'm probably deluding myself. So there is, you're right. There are various moves. There are tendencies within Europe that are, I think, quite hostile to international law taken broadly, or international regulation, or regulation by at the supranational level, and that comes from a variety of reasons, and some of those reasons we don't like, and some of them we do, but in many respects they all form this sort of amorphous sentiment. But I think that's more wider, and one of talking about authors, an author I like very much, I find very stimulating, is a chap called Pankaj Mishra. He's an Indian writer. He writes in English. He now lives in the United Kingdom, I think, most of the time. And he's written 2 books. One is called On the Ruins. He's written more than 2 books, but I'm going to... One is called On the Ruins of Empire, and it looks at anti-colonial thought, you know, in how thinkers in the non-Western world responded to European domination in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So he looks at thinkers and writers from India, from the Middle East, from China and Japan in particular, and how they sought to respond to the fact that, you know, their societies were being dominated by the West, not necessarily through colonialism, but in terms of having a whole new way of doing things imposed on them, having to respond to the global economy, having been told that, you know, the standard of civilization required you to act in a particular way. And his more recent book's got a title, and the title really tells you what it's about. It's The Age of Rage. And he says that's what we see a lot, that the modernity is painful. And, you know, having this incredibly competitive global society is painful, and people are responding to it in various ways. And we all think that, you know, you might think that because we all have mobile phones and can eat at McDonald's that everything's the same, and it's not. And, you know, I think that's the basis of it. We see it in Europe, we see it elsewhere. Does that mean we're an increasingly divided world? That may have been a bit of hyperbole when we wrote the book, but I think there are real divisions. And we can't ignore them. And international law needs to find, and international institutions need to find a way to respond to this. And that is, in many respects, I think, the great project for the next generation. So I don't blame you. You can blame me a bit for the problems, but don't expect me to solve them.
Other questions? Or observation? Now,
You're probably more optimistic than I am. I hope so.
No.
Although you're not
actually,
younger than him.
To the contrary. I have to say, I haven't read the book.
Don't worry.
But, your talk has been very inspiring. You also tried to be balanced, especially in the last observations. You tried to be balanced, especially with your last observations. But, and I'm not trying to draw conclusions. I'm not in a position to do it. But I think we have to come to some sort of conclusion, a provisional conclusion of what we are staying in the present, in a current trend and a current status of international law is bad. This is one of the periods where multilateralism and respect for international law are in crisis. This is not the first one. We had a good period from 1989 to 2001, and then we had a bad period from 2001 to 2008, and then we had again a relatively good period up until last year, and now we have Trump and Putin and Brexit, and so we have to try to cope with it, but we cannot say that, oh, there are some good things about that. I don't think so. International law is in crisis, multilateralism is in crisis. I don't think that, thorough defense of sovereign equality is the best medicine for the rule of law. And I was interested in that declaration that I want to read more carefully. But the starting point, we very much in favor of respect the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Make me think of those declarations at the UN when somebody stands up and say we are really acclaim and very happy about the UN. This is from different US administrations, but we want you to change everything in the Charter and in the way you behave, otherwise we leave. Not only from Republican administrations, but also from the other side. So, I mean, I don't think this is also a good thing. And it's not really a good thing for human rights. You mentioned human rights. This is terrible. It's terrible. I mean, I heard last year the UK delegation coming before the Human Rights Committee and say, we don't like the European Convention. We don't like the European Court of Human Rights. We are thinking of withdrawing. What is that? We are seriously thinking about about getting out. And then, not to speak about Donald Trump, you say wait and see. What else do we have to wait? What else do we have to see? I mean,
no, I agree. He's bad. I just see we need to see in what way he'll be most bad.
At the same time, I mean, this is not the time to say, okay, we give up and we forget about international law or something. There is always the argument according to which if international law is in a bad shape, I don't think that national legislations in many states are in better shape. Yeah. So we don't have to be so pessimistic. One last thing on Brexit. On that, I agree with you. Brexit is bad not only for Britain, it's bad also for the, how can I say, balance of power in the European Union. I think, for example, about the position of Italy. When Italy, in past years, in Italy, people were screaming, or politicians were screaming about, the predominance of Germany. The obvious consequence would be, okay, we look at the UK, we go with the UK and try to balance things. Yeah. Now there is no way to balance anything. You have to stay with the situation that it is. And one other and final comment on Brexit. The importance of having UK on your side in international negotiations. That is really crucial. I have experienced that in the negotiations for the ICC, BEPE 2. The position of the UK changed, I would say, overnight. It was not overnight, but over 2 or 3 weeks.
Change of government.
With a change of government. and with Tony Blair, and what was the name of the foreign minister at that time?
It was the Robin Cook.
Robin Cook.
He's the chap who...
So Elizabeth Wilmshurst changed her mood and attitude towards me overnight. I mean, say, oh,
Elizabeth Wilmshurst.
What a good thing is the ICC.
Was the principal negotiator on the ICC.
She was saying it was terrible, and all the possible worst things about the ICC. But well, the minute in which you had the UK on your side in foreign policy, that would, your chances of succeeding in the negotiations increase dramatically, I think. And this can be applied in many areas, in many fields. So it's not, there are people who say, okay, well, it's better if they go, because they always been some sort in the margin. I agree with that. Always everybody was looking at what the position of the UK, because it was not taken for granted. It was together the majority of the members of the EU, but it's a shame that happened from that point of view. At least.
Of course, you mentioned this over lunch, that the UK always liked to promote itself as a bridge between Europe and the United States of America. I think there's always been a high level of self-delusion in that. Yes, please. But I think there is some truth to it too. It's sometimes said that the US and the UK are two countries divided by a single language, but actually having a single language is not necessarily a bad thing. But you actually, I didn't mention the ICC, and I should have, because of course we have seen, the African states very much resisting the ICC in the last couple of years, but now they sort of, and who knows what's going on. But you're right. We need, and by which, when I say we, I probably mean me and people who agree with me. We is always a great term. If those of us who by and large believe in human rights and democracy and gender equality and all these sort of things, and I suppose a broadly liberal international system, we have to, I think that I'll tell an anecdote. I like anecdotes. I was at a conference some time ago about people talking about international dispute settlement, and I was on a panel which was about insiders and outsiders in international dispute settlement. And one of the speakers said, who was a quite junior international lawyer, said, "I feel I'm an outsider because I don't appear in counsel as counsel in international litigation. I've never sat as an arbitrator. I've not been a judge." And I said, I'm sorry, I have to disagree with you. We are all insiders on this panel. My uncle, who is 80, I found recently, has been out in the streets of his provincial town where he lives in the north of England, leafleting people, telling them in opposition to TTIP. I'm not sure he knows much about TTIP. Certainly he's not read the negotiating text, I'm sure. But whatever it is, he's against it. Now, it's very easy. It's very easy to say he's ill-informed, he's ignorant, he's stupid, whatever. And we might think that. If we're all experts on TTIP, we might think that. But what is behind this concern is a view that these are important, decisions about what can be imported, what can be sold, what we eat. Are decisions that affect us all. They're quite important decisions. And the feeling is, that with things like TTIP and CETA, those decisions are taken a long way away by people who we have no control over. And international lawyers, I have very much argued, that we are the experts and we can be trusted because we know what we're doing. It's been technocratic arguments that have dominated international law in the last few years. And actually, I think we need to be a bit less technocratic and a bit more political. We need to be more politically savvy. We need to realize that we do have a global audience, certainly various national audiences out there, and we need to sell, why we think, if we think international law is a good thing, if we think international institution, a multilateral system is a good thing, if we think cooperation on things like trade, open borders, whatever are good things, then we have to go out and we have to argue it. So I would say, ultimately, we need to be more political. So there you are.
Yeah, this is a good idea. So I'm still wondering whether there is. Oh yes.
I'd like to point out I am, in fact, a Luxembourger.
Change of this nationality.
Yeah. Not yet, but soon.
Almost.
Yeah. Michael Howard, yeah. As if anyone follows me on Twitter, you will have seen my comment on that, which was largely suggesting that we need to obviously lead a flotilla to burn Cadiz. No, not seriously. The whole thing has been marked by an amazing lack of seriousness. My perspective is, I follow someone like Robert McCorkdale, is that it is ridiculous to look at the situation of Gibraltar from the colonial perspective, that there is a treaty between Spain and the United Kingdom that governs the matter, which is the Treaty of Utrecht of 1714, which is a great treaty because it's, in fact, the last international treaty to be written in Latin, if I remember, which is obviously a good thing. We should go back to it. but every time but also I think it's a question of self-determination, and every time the inhabitants of Gibraltar have been asked the question, they have said overwhelmingly that they wish to remain within the United Kingdom. Now, I don't think that ignoring their interests and handing the rock over to Spain is either an acceptable or a desirable solution. And I would point out, of course, that if we are engaging in complaints that states have enclaves in the territory of other states, Spain, of course, has 2 enclaves in the territory of Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla. So I think there is a ridiculous amount of saber-rattling and bad faith, frankly, on both sides. The United Kingdom government for many years refused to involve the government of Gibraltar in any negotiations, which I think was wrong. But fundamentally, I think that the decision has to be taken according to the wishes of the people of Gibraltar, and I would follow what Judge Dillard said in his famous separate opinion, I think it was, in the Western Sahara case, that it is for the people to determine the status of the territory, not the territory to determine the status of the people. That being said, what we have seen is, this happens 1 week after, less than a week after the UK activates Article 50. Whatever you can say about the EU, it meant that these issues were suppressed and that the member states had to come up with mutually agreed solutions. The moment that that pressure is released, we see, frankly, saber-rattling from both sides. I don't think the Spanish intervention was at all helpful. I think the British reaction has been ridiculous, and if you think what Michael Howard said was ridiculous, you should look at the front page of I think the best-selling paper in the United Kingdom still, The Sun, I think from yesterday, which is rather rude about the Spanish, and I will say no more. But it is, once again, a great example, a great advertisement for the European Union, and I think a warning of what happens if states decide to leave, because this is only one of a great number of conflicts that could arise again.
Professor Alini,
yes, a very short question or some reflections. There is a political analyst, Ian Bremmer, is the founder of Eurasia. Yeah. And he wrote a couple of quite interesting books. The first one is, I don't remember exactly the title, but it should be something like What Happens in a G0 World. And the second one, it's a quite recent book, Every Nation for Itself, What Happens When No One Leads the World. Okay? So there is, at least in the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years, many political analysts have said we are in a world in which most probably there is a breakdown in global leadership. So most probably we have to understand what will happen when everybody are going to, let's say, to fight against the other in a quite indiscriminate way. So what I would like to say is that maybe Brexit, but also the Trump politics, could appear from a certain point of view, a certain kind of showing this kind of path or phenomenon in which even very important states from international relation point of view started to behave taking care in a very clear way on their real own interest. That's the real point. So in some ways, that's why also the European Union discourse in some ways is menaced from this idea of taking care just of my things instead to solve the issues globally. So that's why I think that besides the occasion, Brexit, I mean, we know that for 2% we had a certain choice, or Trump for a certain
well, Trump didn't
number.
even get majority.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But I mean, but after all, we can also analyze everything also under this kind of big umbrella of this phenomenon in the long run.
I think that's true. Although whether these states are acting in their own long-term interests, I think is another matter. But certainly there is a feeling that, you know, if we can't influence events, you know, more widely, we're gonna retreat into ourselves. I think that is definitely, you know, and it's seen, you know, the idea is that, you know, if we retreat from the world, we can control things within our own sphere. And I think, unfortunately, that is a myth in today's world. Even North Korea doesn't manage it. Let's face it. And I don't think any of us would want to live in North Korea either. You know, if you look at the sacrifices they put up to isolate themselves to the degree that they have. But I think, I just want to go back to one thing, which is, I think, the Paris Agreement, climate change, which of course is really recent. And I think actually it's a really good example of what you can do. I mean, obviously it's threatened now by Trump, but it is an amazing example. You know, there are people who don't believe in climate change. They fall, as far as I can see, largely into two groups, one of which is people who have an interest in not believing in it. So, you know, people who work for oil companies. It's like people who work for cigarette companies don't believe that smoking gives you cancer. You know, if your livelihood depends on something, it's amazing what you can believe. And then there are, how shall I put it, sort of older people who don't like the idea of having to change their lifestyles. But by and large, the idea that climate change is happening and is a pretty major threat to life, the universe, and everything, certainly our way of life as it exists, has been quite widely accepted. And even developing or newly industrializing states like China, you know, their issues are about, you know, the unfairness of them having to take measures while they're industrializing in a way that, you know, that would disadvantage them when the industrialized states, the Western states, were able to do what they wanted during their period of industrialization. I don't think it's a question for them of equity and fairness rather than, you know, they don't believe the science. So, but how did that happen? And it didn't happen really it did happen with, you know, scientists doing the hard work. There is a technocratic aspect to climate change, but it's also been part of a lot of people trying to convince a lot of other people that this is an important issue on a whole number of levels. People campaigning, you know, people chaining themselves to buildings on the one hand, or leafleting on the other, you know, voting, you know, seeking people's votes, gaining representation within Parliament, and so on and so forth. And I think it is a really good example of, you know, change can take place. Advances, you know, maybe it's an advance that is at the moment halted, and that's actually worrying because we're running out of time. But nonetheless, we can make advances on the multilateral level. States will cooperate if the hard work is done to convince, you know, people within those states, decision makers within those states, that it is in their interest to cooperate, and that multilateralism is the way. That there are a number of issues that are global and can only be dealt with on the multilateral, on a global basis through multilateral action. So I think, you know, it's not all doom and gloom. You know, it's one step. You know, it's two steps forward, one step backwards, maybe. At the moment, it seems quite doom and gloom, but maybe we'll be here, you know, in 5 years' time, talking about international law in a multipolar world, and Trump will be gone, and God knows what will have happened to Putin, and there'll be an outbreak of sense in the United Kingdom and across Europe. I don't know. Yeah, one, I hope. On verra.
If you still
Yeah.
Any other question? Finally, a
There's
final
one
question here. Yes.
Nowadays, we as European citizens are surprised that Britain decided for Brexit, maybe ignoring that in past Britain takes some similar decisions. Do you think that Britain is pursuing again the path of splendid isolation?
There are several questions.
Do you think it's possible to establish such a policy again, especially in a world that changed so drastically?
I think we have to recall that splendid isolation, of course, has not been the dominant policy, the dominant British foreign policy. The dominant British foreign policy has always been to involve itself in Europe and to make sure that there is no single power dominating continental Europe. If we look at that, then withdrawing from the European Union is plainly, under traditional British foreign policy goals, stupid, as it leads to continental Europe being under, I won't say German domination, but Germany will be the most influential, much more influential, I think, within the European Union. So, but you are right. The reasons why Euroscepticism, which I always thought was a rubbish term, because it suggests skepticism is something that we, by and large, think is good, but opposition to the European Union is quite rooted, I think, in you know, it is on the one hand obviously part of a wider discontent with the European Union, but I think it's also, as I said, you know, in all the different states in Europe, opposition to, you know, the established political system, political group, political class, whatever that means, and the European Union have their own specificities, and I think the UK is, you know, is particularly specific, if I can say, in this matter. And I think it's fairly obvious when you think about it that, by and large, the European Union arises out of an experience of defeat and devastation. It comes into being after the Second World War, and it's you know, after, you know, an incredibly devastating conflict where, you know, every state in Europe, with the exception of Switzerland, has been subject to occupation, has suffered, you know, the effects of war, and is very much an idea that based on the idea that through economic cooperation, then, you know, there will never be another war in Europe. And it's been incredibly successful, and that's very apparent when you look at the right up until Mitterrand and Kohl, you know, that is very much, you know, and those are individuals who are leading the European project, who are plainly very affected by their experiences as young men during the Second World War. Now, obviously, we don't have that situation, but that's never really been the situation within the United Kingdom. You know, with the exception of the Channel Islands, the United Kingdom was not occupied during the Second World War. Plainly, it did see the effects of the war, but by and large, you know, in popular culture in the UK, as with the United States of America, the Second World War is seen as the good war. It's seen as, you know, essentially a positive national experience where the United Kingdom stood alone. You know, when the chips were down, it persisted, and in the end, you know, it triumphed, although there is a counter-narrative as well that says that in doing so, you know, it exhausted itself as a nation and as an economy, and there is a truth to that. I always like to wind people up by pointing out, I can't remember what the date is, it's something like 2002. I say it's the day we paid off our national debt to the United States of America incurred during the Second World War. So 50 years to do it. So there are, you know, the reasons why the European project has had support within continental Europe are very different from the reasons that it was supported within the United Kingdom. Interestingly enough, a lot of the people very heavily involved, very pro-European, who very much wanted to bring the United Kingdom into the European Economic Community as then were individuals who had fought in the Second World War, who had seen what had happened to Europe, who had experienced that, and consequently, you know, they had a similar commitment. But it is not the popular narrative, and it is not the narrative in particular that has been driven by the mass media. The ridiculous irony of the situation is, and I recommend a book by a historian called, what is his name, Ramsden, is that, you know, if you look at anti-German sentiment, it dipped considerably, and then it's increased largely because of the press playing it up every time there's a sporting occasion, in particular. So you know, in the UK, it's always been, you know, the UK is detached from continental Europe. It's an island. You know, that affects it. The fact that it's had the experience of war is very different. The fact that, you know, it was always seen as a much more pragmatic, decision based on the economics, on the economic argument, you know, has meant that views of the European Union were different. And I have to say, you know, that the UK has a very concentrated press, which means that a number of, you know, a tightly knit group of motivated individuals have been able to really push the narrative in recent years. I know I shouldn't complain about the press, but anyone who's read the British press will see that there is something to complain about. So back to splendid isolation. Plainly, it's not possible. The British government, the Free Brexiteers, as they're known, the Secretaries of State for the Foreign Secretary for International Trade, the Secretary of State for International Trade, Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, are engaging in magical thinking if they think that they can build trade relations outside the European Union that will in any way compensate for the loss of trade with their major trading partners, which are within the European Union. But there you are. It's, I think, a failure of its historic proportion and entirely against Britain's national interest, as conceived in entirely traditional terms. Ignore ideas of, you know, greater and deeper union. Just look at it in terms of realpolitik. I think it's an enormous failure.
Thank you. And now the game is over, I think. Time is over, at least. Just a few words before thanking Professor Happold. During this hour and a half, I was making all the possible efforts to understand the positive message we can get from the entire lecture and from what is happening in the world. And I started by thinking that maybe the China-Russia joint declaration on the promotion of international law was made on the 25th of June of 2016, when the forecast concerning the American elections were thinking of Hillary Clinton as President of the United States.
It's just after the Brexit vote.
Yeah, but it's just the day after. And so I was thinking, and what could be the positive message that we can elicit from the various issues that have been discussed today. So as far as Brexit is concerned, maybe we can say that Brexit should force the European Union to rethink itself and maybe to improve what has been done in not in a very good manner. So maybe if we think about Brexit, we want to say something positive. We can say that Brexit will force the European Union to do things better. If we think about Trump, we have, I mean, it's quite hard, but maybe this is the last thing I will say. As regards Putin, I will say that maybe, provided that he does not make an alliance with Trump, this means that Putin will counterbalance, or Russia as surely a great power will counterbalance somehow the ideas that the new President of the United States could have about international law. And finally, as regards Trump, of course, I make even a greater effort, and my conclusion is that maybe could counterbalance China as a military power, an economic power, and a state that does not consider, I must say, international law as the leading star of its behavior, especially in the field of human rights. So I like America being a critic of what is happening in China. But frankly speaking, this is what I think with a great effort to think about it. And more realistically, I would say that we have to be vigilant. We have to be ready to understand what's going in the world, because the erratic messages that have been sent until now by several actors of international relations need to be studied also in the light of international law. So thank you very much, Professor Happold. I hope this is only the first of several visits to Trento. And thank you to all those who participated in this very interesting seminar. Thank you.